Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Exposure Scientist podcast. One thing I like to cover on the podcast are subjects that are applicable to both other professionals in the exposure scientist arena and to the general population or people that are generally not really aware of what they may be exposed to in a normal everyday scenario. I recently had the opportunity to write an article on a substance called ethylene oxide. Many of the professionals are probably aware of ethylene oxide and have an understanding of some of the exposure problems related to it. But just to provide context for individuals who are in the general population who may have heard of this substance or may not have, let me just give you some context for it. Ethylene oxide is used in a number of different manufacturing processes. The most familiar one you're probably familiar with or used to is use of antifreeze, ethylene glycol. It's used for manufacturing antifreeze within your vehicles. Other uh, options for use include use of it as a something called a surfactants, which reduces the surface tension in certain application. It's used for adhesives, fiberglass, perfumes, and textiles. It's even used to create lithium-ion batteries that are found in your electric vehicles. There are some uses within personal care products like cosmetics and shampoos. And interestingly, if you're not aware of this, there are established thresholds for use of ethylene oxide as a sterilant in food applications. Ethylene oxide is registered with the EPA for sterilization, for um, sterilization for use in certain scenarios, but it's also registered with FDA. It's available for use on spices and herbs for sterilizing them. And some of the examples are licorice, sesame seeds, and spear. But there are thresholds that FDA has determined that there are safe levels of exposure up to those thresholds without any elevated risk from exposure to those. Ethylene oxide is used in a lot of different scenarios. It's used again for consumer products, but it's also used on large scale scenarios as well. Again, why many of the exposure scientists would be familiar with this because there are uses in industrial settings, not only for the manufacturer, but for sterilization. So I'm going to go into a little bit of what the concern with ethylene oxide exposure is, where it kind of came from, and what is being done about that, and what are the consequences, I'll say, from what's being done to deal with ethylene oxide. So ethylene oxide is a very effective antimicrobial. An antimicrobial means something that is going to reduce or eliminate pests or microbes on a surface. Ethylene oxide is very often used to sterilize medical devices or medical equipment in many different scenarios. When we talk about medical devices, these could be medical implants that are used within human bodies that are going to be sterilized and need to be sterilized to a sufficient level to ensure that there is no reaction or there is no implantation of any microbes within the body once it's used in the human body. A lot of these sterilization processes occur at facilities that are large scale facilities. You may have heard of some of them in the news. You can easily search them up and find them if you type in something like ethylene oxide, fugitive exposure, bystander exposure. You're going to find a lot of information about it online. The important thing here is I want to distill that information to help you understand what the hazards may be, what the risks may be from it. So in those large types of scenarios, there are physical plants, large plants that use a large amount of ethylene oxide to sterilize these types of medical devices. And this is one application. This is a bigger application, which is why it gets a lot of attention. The sterilization used in the ethylene oxide facilities is typically in, I'll say, what is identified as a closed system. These systems are done to ensure that there is minimalized release of material into the atmosphere, into the ambient air outside the facility. One thing that has popped up is there has been concern that there are unaccounted for fugitive emissions from these types of facilities. And the concern is that there are increased risks for individuals who are living around these sterilization facilities in a number of different cities across the United States. And if you're interested, it's easy to find on EPA's website what those facilities are, where they are, and even who manufactured or who owned them and who ran them. It is something to consider because, again, there are processes in place. I mentioned a closed system uh, that these sterilizations occur in. There are recognized what are I'll say one or two chamber systems. They're typically the steps. Generally, the steps involve a fumigation, that's the sterilization of the equipment to ensure that there are no microbes present on any of the surfaces. And then there's what's called an aeration. That aeration process is the desorption of any ethylene oxide from the material out so there's none remaining on that material once it leaves the processing facility. And that material is desorbed and captured, so there's no release. Are there releases? EPA has done some evaluations. So, starting in the mid 2010s, using what's called the National Air Toxics Assessment, EPA identified that there were ethylene oxide detections in a number of different communities surrounding these sterilization facilities. They were evaluated on what's called a census block. So generally, if you think of the census in the United States, there's certain areas or certain districts, and these census blocks were used by the EPA to understand what risks are and identify what exposures may have been. So there are ambient monitors that were set up out there, and these facilities or these areas or census blocks, and they monitored for fugitive releases of ethylene oxide. Why were these fugitive emissions or fugitive releases occurring? Let's start there. Well, it could be a number of different scenarios. It could be that there was ineffective industrial hygiene controls set up. Again, from the industrial hygiene perspective of what we do as exposure scientists, we anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and control those hazards. So if the processes to control those hazards were not effective or not validated, verified, there could have been fugitive releases. That is a number of different scenarios. I don't have information one way or the other if that was occurring or how that's occurring. That's a potential way that it could happen. What were the incidental releases that occurred during sterilization? Did someone accidentally open a chamber before they should have or when they should not have? Was there any leaking of the material and around any of those controls due to deferred maintenance? Or were there accidental releases that were just large releases that were just unintentional? There's a lot of different scenarios. But again, EPA identified that there were detections of ethylene oxide surrounding these facilities that were sterilizing these medical equipment. And based on that, what they did is they have performed some modeling and some risk assessments to identify whether or not ethylene oxide presents a hazard. So, what are the potential hazards for ethylene oxide? So, generally, again, exposure scientists break things down into acute exposures and chronic exposures. Acute are very sudden, and it's a lot of it. Chronic exposures occur over a period of time, months or years. And the acute effects, or example, would be some kind of neurotoxicity, some kind of central nervous system impact, where it may be dizziness or lightheadedness or something like that. But there's the concern that exposure to ethylene oxide will also cause cancer. So the concern for cancer was a big driver in what the EPA was doing to assess the risk of ethylene oxide. So for this risk assessment purpose, ethylene oxide was identified as a carcinogenic hazard. Now, one organization that identified ethylene oxide as a carcinogenic hazard was a group called the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, and they are through the World Health Organization, WHO. So, based on this identification by IARC that there is a potential hazard or carcinogenic or cancer hazard from it, a number of different risk assessments were performed to determine whether or not there were any human health risks from exposure to this. This is where it gets a little interesting and it gets a little, I'll say, a little bit squirrely, to be honest. There is no, I'll say, one consensus model on which carcinogenic or which cancer endpoint should be evaluated and which would be the appropriate modeling for that. So you have to think of individual exposures and think of yourself when you're at home. What these typical models and exposures think of is what are someone's ambient exposures going to be in the community that is surrounding these sterilization facilities. And it gets interesting to think about that because if you think of yourself, if you get up in your morning, you have slept all night inside your house for a number of hours, hopefully 8 hours, but I know not all of us can be that lucky. You get up, you do your morning routine, and you leave your house and go to work. Sometimes work is 5 miles away, sometimes it's 15 or 20 miles away from your house. You spend 8, 9 hours there, maybe 30 minutes each way commuting. Maybe you have to go get kids at school. Maybe you have other errands to run, and maybe you don't get home until 5 or 6 o'clock at night. Then you start your evening routine, you go to bed, and it starts all over again. You go inside your house. Maybe you play for a little while outside. So, what are your potential exposures? What kind of facilities are you living in? Single family homes, multifamily homes? When was the home built? What kind of systems are treating the home? And I say treating as far as providing mechanical ventilation to the home. Are you relying on only mechanical ventilation? For example, where I am in Orlando, it's humid, it's hot. We use a lot of mechanical ventilation here to cool the air to a comfortable level. There are other areas and facilities that don't use as much, and they use, I'll say, natural ventilation, opening windows. Older homes may be a little more gap prone as far as air infiltration versus newer homes. So, what I'm trying to get at is what is your realistic exposure when you are at home or when you are exposed to something in the environment? And again, I mentioned acute and I mentioned chronic. Most of the risk assessments are done using a chronic type exposure scenario. What does chronic type exposure mean? Well, that means they're looking at things where they're presuming things of what your exposures are. And what that presumption typically is okay, well, if somebody is exposed to something that we identify as a carcinogen, we do a risk assessment using mathematical models. And to understand what the potential risk is, we are conservative in that assessment. So, in the EPA and other assessments that were done, they said, okay, well, we're going to presume that there were exposures for 24 hours a day, that they were exposed for the entire year. And based on those exposures, because how risk assessments are done for carcinogens, and this is a whole nother different discussion, but for carcinogens, we're going to average that over a 70-year lifetime. But what are your actual exposures when you are thinking about how long you may be not only in your house, but maybe outside your house? Because again, remember, these exposures, these ambient exposures were measured in the outside ambient environment. What are your exposures within your house? What are exposures within businesses that are in these census blocks or are close to this? A lot of them don't have, well, a lot of homes don't have fresh air intakes on their HVAC systems. They're very much a closed system, so to speak. Again, people don't really have windows open down where I am. In northern areas, they may, but ambient conditions may also dictate what the exposures and concentrations are. So when you think about how these risk assessments are performed and these models that are used for identifying it, you have to consider what are your potential individual exposures, or what are your exposures going to be in a realistic way. If you're at work for 8 or 9 hours or 10 hours a day, and you're out running errands and you're not home much, are you at an increased risk? And that's hard to answer with some of the assessments that are done because they are using these very conservative assessment models. So, taking a step, if you think about the assessments or the exposures that I discussed previously about sterilization facilities, and I'm giving them a lot of discussion here, but there's going to be additional discussion a little later on about other types. You have to think about, okay, well, there are established occupational exposure thresholds. When you think occupational, you think OSHA. There are thresholds that are established for determining what exposures in the employment type scenario is and how to protect employees. And that's where a lot of the focus was for many years on this. What were the exposures that an employee would have in these types of facilities? As the EPA identified in the 2010s when they're identifying these fugitive concentrations, I say fugitive, ambient releases or ambient air concentrations outside of ethylene oxide, a new type of exposure model had to be identified. And what they have used and others have used here is what's called the bystander receptor model. You're not employed, you're not working there, you're not using the materials, but you are just simply a bystander to the exposure. So when you're performing these models where you're looking at 24 hours exposures for entire year, averaged over 70 years, they are considering those as bystander exposures. So what are the potential bystander exposures? And like I said, how are you being a bystander? Is it from being outside? Is it from being inside and outside? Those are things that play into how we as exposure scientists think about this from a realistic standpoint instead of a conservative theoretical standpoint when doing these types of risk assessments. So these assessments have been done, and interestingly, they have had a few iterations over the years. And I say that because the carcinogenic endpoint that has been identified, I'll say, has changed a little bit. So EPA is a group that performs these types of risk assessments on exposures. EPA has identified that exposure to ethylene oxide is carcinogenic to humans. There's also another group called the National Toxicology Program, NTP. They performed a regulatory review of epidemiology studies and other studies to identify and come to that same conclusion. What's interesting is that a different group, I lived in Texas for a few years, so those who are in Texas may be familiar with this. They are a group called the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ. They perform an assessment using their modeling and their understanding and their review of the data, and they identified that ethylene oxide is likely to be carcinogenic to humans. So from the scientific standpoint, there's slight nuance differences between determining whether something is likely to be carcinogenic to humans and being actually identified as carcinogenic to humans. And that goes within the modeling and how you do the modeling and how you do the assessments and how you do the data interpretation. And I mentioned earlier the types of cancer that is evaluated and who may be at risk for that, and what the data show. And actually, there I'll say some disagreements between different organizations on the outcome. So there are data that suggests that there are, for lack of better terminology, blood cancers associated with exposure to ethylene oxide, and breast cancer supposedly associated with exposure to ethylene oxide. Some organizations identify that both are potential outcome endpoints, and others say, well, we only identify one of those. The data is not supportive of the other. So when you're looking at the risk assessments that are performed, you have to understand, well, what endpoints are they looking at and how do they differ and why do they differ? Because understanding why they differ is just as important as determining how they differ, or what exactly methodology that they're using. So another difference here is that EPA in 2016, they they determine a risk characterization, or cancer risk characterization, uh, and that iteration changed over a few years. They have evolved slightly, and the EPA has gone back and forth about that. They at one point were using what exposure scientists call a linear risk assessment model, um, but they have changed that assessment uh, in recent years to go use a different model. TCEQ use a slightly different model. They use different inputs, they use different endpoints, and when they do that, there are discrepancies. Sometimes the discrepancies are a few order of magnitude in difference. So when we as exposure scientists come to that information, we have to take all of it into consideration. What the different methodologies are, what the different risk assessment paradigms are that are used by different agencies and organizations. And that's why I look, and again, they're being protective of all populations and subpopulations. And that's why their assessments are conservative in nature. When we are doing our assessments for a realistic standpoint, we have to look at this and say, let's look at what the actual exposures are. Going back to thinking of how you are in your home. Again, if you think of what your activities are in your home or going to work, whatever, they may be entirely different from the next 24-hour exposure, because you're not going to be likely not at your home for 24 hours a day, every day, for a number of years. So that understanding is very important when you're hearing news stories or seeing articles, and they're just saying, if you live in these areas, you're at increased risk for a health outcome and it's not safe. The safety of it has to be taken in the context of risk and your individualized risk. And by thinking of that, you have to account for it. Now, one thing that is important is I brought this up as well, is, I mentioned the word associations. If you are having a health outcome from the exposure, there are ways in which scientists have a scientific method for identifying a causal relationship between the exposure and the outcome. And those go into, I'll say, an individualized assessment of risk. And this is more streamlined than it is for the general conservative assessment. This is a very pinpointed assessment to identify, let's just say, um, Joe Smith says he has a cancer outcome. Okay, well, let's look at Joe Smith's individual risk from exposure, understand what he exposed to, what his activities are, etc. Having a blanket idea is identifying, I'll say, a general elevated risk for an area, for potential risk, for a potential outcome. The actual outcome or cause of someone's, I'll say, disease or health problem has to be evaluated at an individual level to understand what their actual risk is. So I'm hoping I'm putting some of this in context for what what you see as far as discussions of ethylene oxide in the news, or a lot of information that's out there, to kind of make you think that, listen, this is not what I'm going to be exposed to. I don't, I may sleep in my bed for 8 hours a day. I use the HVAC. My home is a tight home. Nothing, no air gets in here. I don't keep the windows open. You have to think about your exposure scenario. Um, Not only, I'll say, for ethylene oxide, but many different exposures in the environment. So why is all this? We know that all this is taking place, and again, I focus on the sterilization facilities, but there are facilities that use sterilization not on a mass scale. Hospitals have used them. Dental clinics have used them. I'm understanding some veterinary clinics use ethylene oxide potentially for sterilization. So there are small scale applications as well. However, the large scale have been the ones that have received the most attention. They have received the most attention to the point that in March of 2024, the EPA announced that they finalized the national emission standards for hazardous air pollution for ethylene oxide for commercial sterilizers. So the goal of the EPA's finalization of this is to reduce ethylene oxide emissions and lifetime cancer risks surrounding these sterilization facilities. So there has been an effort to minimize fugitive exposures in these communities. That's fine. That's great. But what are the effects? You have to look at not only uh, the causal analysis for any health outcomes, but what was the cause of the fugitive releases? Or the cause something that would be easy to fix at these facilities? Is it something that would be very cumbersome? Is it something that may result in incomplete sterilization of medical devices because the emissions have to be lowered so much that there may be incomplete sterilization? Whenever you change something at one point, that's going to have downstream impacts. What are the downstream impacts? I think that's important to consider and understand when you're looking at ethylene oxide. Another change that was finalized in April of 2024 by EPA was actually expanding the rules to target manufacturers using ethylene oxide. Not only using it, but producing ethylene oxide for downstream use, or use in manufacturing or sterilization or what have you. Again, further attempt to reduce ambient levels in the community. What are going to be the effects of this? I don't know, honestly, at this point, what the effects are. It's going to likely reduce fugitive emissions, likely going to reduce ambient concentrations of ethylene oxide in these communities. But are the risks that are being assessed here realistic for any particular health outcomes, or is a general blanket conservative risks that are being managed here? That's important if you are specifically either living in some of these communities or assessing the health of some of these communities that are living and surrounding these plants, because there's lots of things that go into the assessment. I mentioned the health outcome. There's different consensus agreement on what type of cancer ethylene oxide is going to cause in humans. What are the exposures? One thing also to consider, what are the laboratory methodologies that are assessing these? There in some of the applications evaluations, there are different methods for assessing the ethylene oxide in the communities. The exposure scientists listening to this can understand that if you're using different labs and different methods, it may make comparison of data more difficult. So those are things that go into the assessment process when looking at ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide is not going anywhere. It's going to have to be here. It's efficient for use in automobile applications, for having coolant in our cars. It's used in a lot of different intermediaries. Now, for different applications of either cosmetics or other ones? Are those going to, or, looking at some spices and herb sterilization, is that going to get a second look? Possibly. The EPA's evaluation may have kicked off secondary evaluations or reevaluations of something that was determined maybe 20, 30 years ago using more recent data. And I think it's important to remember, again, what downstream impacts is that going to have on the products or on the use? It's still going to be around, but in the meaning of what EPA is doing as far as reducing fugitive sterilizations, that's going to be impact. I'll just say, for example, I know some of these sterilization facilities have decided to shut down and not continue sterilization just because the requirement or the need to control to reduce ambient exposures was so, what they identified for their system, so burdensome, it was just easier to shut down the facility. Does that overall help the end user of the medical devices? Does it make it more difficult? Does it change the supply and demand of those products that are efficiently sterilized? Again, there's downstream impacts to all of this, but I'm hoping today I was able to put some, pardon me, the discussion of ethylene oxide into context for you, understand why things have been done, understand what has been identified, what the hazards are, what the potential risks are, and how to look at these bystander exposures in a realistic exposure scenario. Again, recently wrote an article about this. I'm happy to have a discussion with you about it further or give you more information on it. But it just kind of prompted my want to have this discussion and say, listen, there are differences in exposure and what the dose actually is that someone actually gets. That goes into the individualized exposure assessment. Just because they say that there's an elevated risk from exposure doesn't mean that you actually fit their exposure scenario. Your individualized exposure has to be considered when you're doing these assessments. And to contextualize some of this information, I hope that helps out. I'll say everyone who's listening to this, that's the ultimate goal here, is to help you understand when you see risk assessments, when you see evaluations, when you see any news articles that are discussing the deadly exposures to ethylene oxide, it all has to be taken within context and understand that there's a lot of variables that are conservative that goes in these assessments. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope to catch you in the next one soon. Thank you.